Okay, hello to all the students in the junior seminar, Process to Synthesis class. Today's lecture, this video, or actually series of videos, will be three of them maybe, I think is going to be on process. And so we're going to be talking about a number of things having to do with process. Maybe the first thing I want to say is, so we're kind of at the heart of the Process to Synthesis lectures where we're going to talk about process, concept, and product. And some of you may, to a certain degree, wonder, why do we do process before concept? Many of you might think it makes more sense to do concept first and then process. And that's certainly a reasonable way to approach it. But I like to focus on process first because I think it's important to consider how much process can also help you generate concept. That process is not just the way you physically make artwork. Process can also be the way you generate your ideas, the process you use for idea generation, for ideation, for refinement, for development. And so that's important. And so because of that, I think it's good to start with process first, because process, I think asking yourself questions about why you follow the certain processes that you do, both in terms of how you make artwork, as well as how your body of artwork develops and how your ideas develop, why you follow those processes, and asking yourself those questions is really important. So there's a number of parts to this lecture, which is 5 parts right here. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but instead, as we're looking at this list and these this breakdown, I want to talk primarily about how process, um, like why is it important? And I think that it's really important for a young studio artist because, after all, it is the way you make stuff, right? It is the how compared to concept being the why and product being the what, the thing you actually make. But it's the thing that determines everything else. Like process, in the end, is the fundamental way we achieve product. Process is the fundamental way, oftentimes, that we developed concepts. That concepts develop over time and they develop through a process. And include processes include, our idea development processes as well our our physical processes. So I think that it's really important for students. And I guess the other thing I would say is that, like, students tend to put a lot of, not, they put too little thought on process. They tend to assume process. They tend to assume that whatever way of making a thing seems most natural to them, that is the best way for them, rather than to challenge themselves in terms of process. And I think if you challenge yourself in terms of process, you often then find that you are making better work, and also you're getting a better relationship in terms of figuring out your ideas. So this lecture, like it says on the first page, first thing we're going to do is a very brief kind of like look at art history and how the idea of process relates to that. And so the very first thing I want to say is that, like, if there was some sort of primordial time when people made artwork before there was a lot of other human culture issues like, power relationships and religious power struggles, um, at, then there probably was a time, maybe there was a time when human beings made art where process and concept and product were all, unified in a whole. But to a certain degree, most of the history of art has put product and finish as being a more important thing than the artist kind of following a process. And so most of the history of art is about these very kind of product focused ways of making art, where it's very much about pleasing a certain client, and it puts polish and finish and technique and presentation over other values. And that's fine. I think that there's, I mean, some amazing artwork that's been made because of that. And there are exceptions to this rule, and I think those are important to pay attention to as well. But I think that if you look really carefully at the history of art, you can see that the idea of artists putting a certain amount of faith and trust in the process does come up in different places at different times, and I'm not going to cover all of them, but I will talk about this one kind of issue with the development of painting, and specifically with oil painting, um, into the Baroque, like the late Renaissance period into the Baroque. And what we see is we see more and more artists who approach painting in a painterly manner, in an open-ended painterly manner, where the finding of imagery becomes part of the process, and where the hand of the artist, the way the artist puts the mark down, becomes just as important as the finish, right? In some ways more important, right? Because after all, a painting like the Flaying of Marsyas is not really much about finish, but it's much more about mark making. And so we can see this a little bit in terms of a contrast between, normally Carracci is often posed as like the complement to Caravaggio, but I'm going to pair him with a later Baroque artist, Tiepolo, and for you to kind of see two different kind of Baroque approaches to art making. One that's very, very tight and formal, and one that's much more loose. We can see this divide again in the in the 19th century with the sort of the Ingres Delacroix debate, where some artists were very much for drawing as the starting point of painting, and drawing being very much based on the line, whereas Delacroix and the people who kind of followed his way of thinking saw it as being about mark making and painting and shape first, and about color first. And Delacroix's painting was much more loose and gestural, and it's much more about the finding of the imagery, finding of the ideas in the artwork, rather than controlling it from sort of a very self-conscious top-down approach, artists dominating their artwork. So through all of this art, through what we've been talking about in terms of art history, there's this underlying tension between those who view art as being about very product oriented, and those who try to embrace a more process open or process focused approach. But I don't think we really see, at least in Western art, a very very open acceptance of process focused approaches to art until the 20th century, and especially with the surrealists, who really love these very open process, kind of random process ways of making artwork, because they see it as a way of opening up or unleashing the power of the unconscious. And a good example of this is the later paintings of Max Ernst, where he would make these paintings where he produces a lot of just random, just textures and mark making, that is like with pressing stuff into the wet oil paint and using these transparent layers of paint, and just kind of creating all these different kind of textures, and then finding from the textures his imagery, like letting the imagery kind of speak to him from what's on the surface, and creating these kind of spaces. And this is a very kind of open-ended type of process where there's no set idea of what it's going to look like, and that he just allows it to happen. And that, if you understand then how something like the development of the abstract expressionists, especially work, like the work of someone like Jackson Pollock, as coming out of that idea, it starts to make Pollock's work make more sense, where it is coming out of these kind of surrealist ideas of developing processes that are very open-ended, that allow the artist to react to the art and to find things in the art, and then rather than to kind of like have a preset idea of like this is what the art should be from the beginning. So then the artwork becomes much more a process of discovery and of struggle, rather than a process of top-down dictation. So how are we doing on time? Oh, we're right at about the break time. So we're going to end right here, where we're going to, but before we're going to get to talking about some artwork post the abstract expressionists, and so we need to define a bunch of terms to do that. So that's where we'll start up next. All right, thanks.